Welcome to another exciting leg of the journey of Paul in his travels as he is making his way to Rome, where he will have that opportunity to defend himself as he's desired for so long. Once again, I have found this to be one of the most exciting studies that I've done of the Acts of the Apostles. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps it's because I have delved into and listened to the text and read the text more carefully than before. But this particular part is almost like a James Bond movie, almost like some of the political shenanigans we see across the world, uh, even today. The plots in order to eradicate someone who is opposed to a view that you might have, etc. So the Apostle Paul is being arrested in Jerusalem, and he's going to be headed toward Rome, and this is one of the steps that we will follow. And I hope you will read the text with that in mind, that here is the apostle Paul who is taking the message of Christ to that ancient world. He is being resisted both by those who are opposed, that is, the Jews, and even others in the world that we see every day that are opposed to good and those things that we uh, fight for and desire. So we'll get into the text, and I'll give you first an overview of the things that we're going to see in this text. Of course, the Jewish council, which is made up of the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, and they're the ones that he is going to encounter there. He stands before the Sanhedrin, and he was very familiar with Sanhedrin. Paul was a Pharisee. He called himself a Pharisee of the Pharisees, studied under Gamaliel, was very familiar with the law in and out, and from all evidence was a brilliant man, because we have 5 or 7 undisputed letters, but a total of 13 letters in the New Testament that many attribute to Paul. Of course, there are always those who are continuing to study and find clarity in all of the writings, etc. But he stood firmly before the Sanhedrin, in emphasizing that not only his teachings were relevant and his teachings were of a good purpose, but also he lived out those in his life, that wherever you touched Paul, you would find that he lived according to the principles that he taught. So he stood there before them, both in his word and with his works, that he was a testimony to be depended upon before them. Ananias, the high priest, reacts violently to Paul's statement. Maybe just stop for a moment. We have similar names in different places. You may remember that we had Ananias, at Damascus, that was the man who uh, laid hands on Paul, and his eyes were opened and his vision was cleared up. We had Aeneas, who was in the area of Joppa and Lydda, who was healed. And now we have another Ananias, who is the high priest. It's, I guess, like common names that we see, and sometimes we get them confused. As a matter of fact, when I'm speaking and talking about Paul and Peter, I often get those two mixed up. So it's not uncommon to get names confused. Even my grandfather, it seems that he went through the whole litany of the 4 boys in our family before he ever called the right name. So I hope that people and places are important, that I continue to emphasize and we need to make the distinction of the roles of those who have the same names. So there was Ananias the high priest, who was just very opposed to Paul. And I think some of the nature of Paul comes out in his reaction, and we'll talk about that when we get to the text. There was a difference in the Pharisees and the Sadducees regarding the nature of the risen Christ, the nature of the resurrection. You've often heard that the Pharisees, because he knows that Christ rose from the dead, and the Sadducees are sad because they deny the resurrection, and many make that distinction so they get clarity as to what the beliefs were the two. But Paul does, I think, an amazing trick that all of us can learn from satanic and evil forces, and that is the trick of dividing and conquering. We'll talk about that a little later on as well. God appears to Paul in a vision. During the night, the Lord reassures Paul not to worry because he is guiding Paul, he is protecting Paul, and it's going to be his providence and guidance that brings him to the full destination of his purpose in Rome, where he is able to defend his faith, and he's able even to move farther on and do other things. This is where the plot becomes like a novel, like a James Bond movie. That is, there's a plot against Paul, those who were going to, that he conspired to kill him. And that is thwarted, and God again prevails. It was his nephew that had the information that brought this to a closure. I think this is the first and perhaps the only place in the New Testament where we get to close enough to learn Paul had other relatives, and they are not named except by their relationship to Paul. And so it is his nephew, his sister's son, that we meet at this occasion. But Paul is moved to Caesarea with armed guards guarding him. And that's, again, the evidence of the law of Rome, the Roman law that had its purpose to protect citizenry. They were prideful of the law in Rome to protect their citizens, even to the point of wanting Rome to be at peace. And we see that as it occurs. So God's providence ensures Paul's mission that it remains intact. And God is busy because there's so many forces trying to thwart that plan, but God is always ahead of us and evil. And it's interesting, again, this makes this an intriguing story of the adventurous natures that come through the book of Acts. To me, it's exciting, and I hope for you it is as well. Let's look at the text from beginning to end of chapter 23. Paul looks straight at the Sanhedrin. Now, to me, this indicates that Paul was not at all afraid of those who could kill him, or those could have him killed. So he looks right at these folks and gives his defense, which was that he was an unwavering, faithful follower of Jesus Christ. Just think, it only had been a few years since Paul was a rabid opposer of Christianity in the name of Judaism. But that event on the road to Damascus was that turning point in his life that changed all that. 3 times Paul tells that story in the book of Acts. Now, our story is a story that we need to keep fresh in our mind and close on our lips, because it's the story of the experience that seems to always win out when we come to conversations about what God is about and who God is. It's undeniable when we give witness to what we have experienced in our relationship with God and what God has done for us. Well, the Sanhedrin, listening to him, they again were filled with anger. Now, this is a combination of both uh, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But again, they were bound together simply because they both opposed Paul. And it's that uh, network that Paul is going to attack in a very clever way to bring back confusion among them. The outcome was that the Sanhedrin failed to reach a verdict, and eventually he was led and given back to the authorities that were going to ensure that he made his trip to Rome, where he would stand before the officials there, which was his goal from the very beginning. So he went to the Sanhedrin and he spoke before them. He said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience to this day. There is nothing more powerful than a life that is lived in congruency with the claims that one makes. It is the story of the connection between belief and behavior. It is the story of works and faith. And so we stand before people and we tell our story. And if our story does not match our beliefs, or our beliefs and behavior are opposed to one another, it's very difficult for anyone to take us serious. Then Ananias ordered those who were standing there next to him to strike him on the mouth. This is an interesting event because here, in violation of the law, Paul is struck at the words of Ananias the high priest. And then Paul, I think, does what I consider to be a noble thing. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall." Now, you recall that Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed sepulchres, which was a indication that they looked good on the outside, but they were dead on the inside. The whitewashed gave the evidence of purity, but as I understand, the tombs were whitewashed so that it could be easily seen as people traveled at night. Well, he called them whitewashed, that is, looking good on the inside, but not so in the looking good on the outside, but not on the inside. Now, here's how he explains that. Paul said, "You are sitting there judging me according to the law. You're judging me according to the law. Yet, in violation of the law, you are ordering me to be struck." Now, at that moment, Paul has made his statement, but then they call Paul into question, and Paul offers, I think, an apology for not obeying the laws and the teachings of Christ, that we are to obey or to respect the authority over us. And so, not to violate the inner principles of those he opposed, he offers an apology. And those were verse 4, those standing by said, "Do you dare revile God's high priest?" Now they are appealing to his religious nature at this point. This is a high priest that you are to respect. Then Paul reminds them, he said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. It is written, you must not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul recognizes that perhaps he has been himself overreactionary. You may not see that, but that's how I see it. And then verse 6 is to me one of the cleverest things that I've seen in terms of how a man is able to change the conversation in such a way that those who are bringing the charges then get into a great and a discussion among themselves, which takes really the pressure off of Paul. When Paul, verse 6, when Paul realized that one of them were Sadducees and the other part were Pharisees, he cried out in the Sanhedrin, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am being judged because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Of course, the Pharisees didn't know fully or understand or even accept fully what Paul was saying, but they did believe in the resurrection from the dead. However, the Sadducees, that is why they're sad, they did not believe in the resurrection. As a result, you see in verse 7, when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Now, that is the trick of Satan from the beginning. That is the trick of deception and evil from the doorsteps of the Garden of Eden. It is there that Satan is able to divide and conquer. Nations will not stand when they are divided. Husbands and wives will not be able to stand when they are divided, and Satan is always engaged in that plot. However, as Paul did it, he meant it for good. And so he took the very nature of evil itself and used that to bring about that disruption and to bring about the discord among the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which took really their focus off of why they were there. Verse 8, for the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees affirm them all. So they get into now a theological discussion, which of course has never been resolved among the groups, and they remain divided. This brought about continued chaos, and violence continued to soldier, and it soon broke out. The shouting grew loud, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party got up and argued vehemently. We find nothing evil in this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? When this verse 10, when the dispute became violent, the commander feared that Paul might be torn apart. Again, they are protectors as the law is being implemented in the Roman way. They were concerned for the safety of Paul. That's what happens in our nation when people with opposing ideas come together, or a person comes with an opposing idea. The state or the government is concerned about seeing that person being protected. Well, they were concerned about Paul, and so they took charge of him, ordered the troops to go down and take him away and bring him to the barracks where they could put him in sort of a house arrest, but there for his safety and his protection. However, this is not the end of what I consider the James Bond kind of movie. The following night, in verse 11, the Lord stood by them and said, and he offers what he always gives us in time of testing. I love the passage in 2 Timothy where Paul says to young Timothy, God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and soundness of mind. He wants us to be courageous in the face of difficulty. And so he says, have courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for me to testify in Rome. That was what Paul was wanting. He was wanting the ears of those in charge. And so it was Rome that he wanted to go to. Of course, this shows us the modern day Rome. Well, no, this Bible is a part of the Roman setting at that particular time. And and of course, this is the only biblical, I guess, place that I have been to. But of course, I did not see a lot about the biblical journey of Paul while I was there, which I regret. But here, this is the Rome of his day that he wanted to go to. And of course, Rome was considerable distance, or he was on the Mediterranean east coast, and he had to go all the way across Mediterranean Sea in order to get to Rome, and that was what he was wanting, where he was wanting to eventually go. And so it was there that they wanted to protect him so he could make that journey. But here's the plot against Paul. As his faith continued to enable him to preach, and the opposing forces wanted him destroyed, they continued to plot against him. It says in verse 1, it says in this verse that the Jewish leaders were determined to silence Paul's influence, and they wanted him eliminated. It makes no difference. We can eliminate people, but the message continues. And the message of Christianity has seemed to always grow stronger and faster and move to regions of the world under pressure and persecution more than in days when there are no evil forces at work publicly against it. That can be borne out in many places, particularly China. When it was discovered after years of the underground church that enormous number of followers of Christ were in the underground movement, and only in recent years it was known how many people were in that time following Christ, even though it was against the law. Then the warning comes. Now, this is the text says it is Paul's sister's son. Of course, that would be his nephew, and somehow he had that information, and he came and began to tell that story, and they then protected him and got him before the officials so he could tell the story of the plot that was developing. As a result, it says there were more than 40 who had formed the plot against Paul. Well, let me go back to verse 21, though. There was a conspiracy, but there was a group of people who made that commitment themselves bound under a curse. They put themselves under a curse. Now, these are what are called curse tablets. These have not been opened because they wanted to preserve them, so the information is still concealed there, but nonetheless, these are actual representations of those curse tablets, which they made an agreement that they would do a certain thing, and of course, they made it a public thing by writing on the curse tablets, but then also they made it more public because they made a decision not to eat or drink until they killed Paul. You remember that Jesus like Samson of old, was a Nazarite. As a result of being a Nazarite, the covenant was that you did not cut your hair. Well, these people made this covenant, and under the curse, they made these cursed tablets to bind themselves together. As young boys, we did that kind of thing when we decided that we would band together. We had these very infantile kinds of things that we would do to be banded together as a group in those play days. Well, these 40 were not playing. They were forming a plot that would ultimately be squashed. They formed a plot, and the chief, in verse 14, these men went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn curse that we won't eat anything until we have killed Paul." That's how serious this whole plot was and what they were trying to do. And so it reveals to us and how perilous and treacherous it was for Paul to keep on preaching. Verse 15 reveals, so now, along with the Sanhedrin, that is, those who were the council that were making the decision, we make a request to the commander that he bring him down to you, as if you were going to investigate his case thoroughly. But before he gets here, we are ready to kill him. And so he wanted them to agree and collude with them in the destruction of Paul. But here is the revelation, verse 16. It was the son of Paul's sister, his nephew, who heard about this ambush and came and entered the barracks and reported to Paul. Now, when he reported to Paul, again, this reveals how insecure in some ways Paul was. For him to be able to make entry and get to Paul, you would think that there may have even been a more secretive and clandestine kind of way to kill Paul. That is, one person to commit a murder rather than a group of 40. But nonetheless, he had access to Paul. But when Paul heard this, apparently he still had the ear of the people in authority. And verse 17 reveals how he did that. Paul called on the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander, because he has something to report." Now, when I hear this and see this, it again confirms the importance of what we are able to do when we stand and make our personal statement about what we have seen and heard. Of course, this was the plot to kill Paul because he had firsthand information. He was an eyewitness. He had heard this. His testimony was important. Now, in our day, our testimony, that is, not so much what we read in the biblical text, but what we discover in living out the biblical text, that becomes our testimony to the truth of the resurrection and the power of the resurrection, plus the power of following in obediently the teachings of Christ. So that is where our power lies, in our ability to tell what God has done for us and the way that we have experienced that. So in verse 18, apparently they took him serious. They took him to the commander, and he said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. I'm sure that at the risk of his life, this is what the young man did. I'm sure he was taking a great risk to reveal this plot that he had heard. And to me, it's rather amazing that they took him seriously. Well, verse 19, the commander took him by the hand, led him aside, and inquired privately. And he wanted to know, are you really sure? What is it you have reported to me? And then he goes on, the Jews, he said, have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow, as though they are going to hold a somewhat more careful inquiry of him. And so in verse 21, but don't let them persuade you, because there are, and he reveals the plot, there are more than 40 of them who are waiting in ambush, the men who have bound themselves under that curse tablet that I showed you. They were bound and determined to take Paul out. He said they have bound themselves under the curse not to eat or drink until they have killed him. Now they are apparently waiting for your consent. And so they engaged in this conversation. And of course, the commander did not want anything to do with this because he knew that as a citizen of the law, a protector of the law, he stood to be in violation of the law. Verse 22, so the commander dismissed the young man and instructed him, don't tell anyone about what you have informed me about, that you have informed me about this. And then, of course, under the dark night, he put together, that is, the commander put together, verse 23, centurions. He took 200 soldiers ready with 70 cavalry and 200 spearmen to Caesarea at 9 tonight. So he began preparing for battle, verse 24. Also provided mounts so that Paul might be brought safely to Felix the governor. Now remember, we're going to close this chapter. This is really background to the next lesson that is in the series of those of you who are doing the series following the book of Acts. But he writes a letter, and he sends a letter along with those who are carrying Paul. And then we have the contents of that letter. He wrote the following letter: Claudius Lysias, the most excellent governor Felix. Then he says, when this man had been seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, I arrived with my troops and rescued him because I learned that he is a Roman citizen. We depend on our country to protect us against the evil dangers of other principalities, other governments. And so Rome took great pride in this, and they were not going to stand aside and watch this treacherous deed done. Verse 28, wanting to know the charge they were accusing him of, I brought him before the Sanhedrin. Now, you see, he is saying, I brought them to the legal body of the Jews. You are the legal body for all citizens. So that's what I did. I carried them before the Sanhedrin. Then in verse 29, I found out that accusations were concerning questions of their law, and that there was no charge that merited his death or imprisonment on the Roman law. He said, when I was informed that there was a plot against this man, I sent him to you right away. So I ordered his accusers to state their case against him. And so here they are describing what took place. So the soldiers, during the cover of darkness, during the night, brought him to another place where they were to seek safety to Antipatris. And here is a picture of the ruins of that city. And it was an important city. And most of the cities that had importance in that day were always strategically a place where the crossroads of the world came, where there was a lot of traffic. So that's where they brought him for safe keeping. Then he says in verse 32, the next day they returned to the barracks, allowing the cavalry to go on with him. When these men entered Caesarea and delivered the letters to the governor, they also presented Paul. Now, this is where they get verification to Paul's citizenship. And so they asked him the question. After he read it, he asked Paul what province he was from. When he learned that he was from the province of Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing whenever your accusers get in place. So he was going to protect him, and it was going to be in this area in Caesar's palace that he was where he was giving the orders for them to keep Paul protected until the accusers came. Again, you see a reflection of the system of law and protection in that day as it is reflected in our day. And so we come to the closing section of this chapter, which is basically background for the next lesson. But to me, it is intrigue and adventure, plots and saving and protection in order to assure that Paul has his rights protected so that he can preach the gospel and stand in face of the civil authorities as well as the religious authorities and give witness and testimony to what God is doing as he continues to preach the gospel. I hope you can use this in your background study as you prepare for the lesson that we see next in chapter 24. Would you join me as we pray? Father, you are so gracious. And we see he lived out in the life of Paul how a servant was willingly protected by you in order to accomplish your will. Help us to be reminded that the safest place for us is in your will for our life. Wherever that takes us, perhaps it takes us to dangerous places in the world. Perhaps it takes us through the valley of the shadow of death. Maybe it is taking us into places where there are all kinds of evil lurking to destroy us. But knowing, Father, that we are safely in your will and that you are protecting us and carrying us to the conclusion of what you have for us to do is for us a wonderful envelope of life that enables us to live, Father, triumphantly as we have a strong finish. For Christ's sake, I pray. Amen.